Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report Number 118-59, offered by Ms. Jacobs of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 3908, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Jacobs, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today to protect public safety and honor the original intent of this bill through a simple common sense amendment. Many of us on both sides of the aisle agree with the goal of H.R. 3091 to allow federal law enforcement officers to buy retired handguns, many of which are already required to be destroyed. But an oversight could enable domestic abusers, including those subject to restraining orders, to get firearms, which we all know can have deadly consequences. Police officers are human. They aren't immune from mental illness, domestic and family conflict, and other stressors that can lead to tragedies. So we can and should have guardrails to prevent those tragedies. That's why my amendment simply ensures that each federal law enforcement agency has procedures for determining whether an officer is in good standing to buy a firearm. Agencies would have the flexibility to tailor those determinations based on the qualifications of each agency, but these guidelines should be clear and concise. Existing federal law already carves out special treatment for law enforcement officers by allowing them to have a gun even if they have a domestic violence restraining order. That's dangerous. All gun owners should meet the same standard, and law enforcement agencies shouldn't consider an officer who is perpetrating violence against a family or household member to be in good standing and able to buy a handgun. While I'm thankful that the Rules Committee supported my amendment, I'm disappointed that they rejected my other amendment and several of my colleagues' amendments to provide additional guardrails for this buyback program. Still, with this amendment, we have an opportunity to improve this legislation. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to save lives, protect public safety, and honor those who put their lives on the line for our communities. I yield back the balance of my time. I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I claim the time in opposition to this amendment.
And that's for 5 minutes.
Good standing is already universally understood by all federal agencies. If an officer has been suspended, they surrender their badge and gun and do not have law enforcement authorities. This is not a new concept. In fact, the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act, which was signed into law 19 years ago, requires a finding of good standing by the agencies in order for retired officers to be eligible to carry a concealed weapon. By requiring an agency to adopt standards to determine good standing for the purposes of this bill, her amendment would establish a double standard where a law enforcement officer could be in good standing for the purposes of their job, but the agency considers them not to be in good standing for the purposes of purchasing a retired service weapon. This potential two-track system is ripe for abuse. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
I'll just note that there is a loophole where law enforcement officers can keep a gun even when they have a domestic violence restraining order. And with that, I will yield 1 minute of my time to the gentleman from New York.
Gentlelady yields 1 minute to the gentleman from New York.
Thank the gentlelady, Mr. Speaker. When Congresswoman Demings introduced her superior version of this legislation last Congress, it required the law enforcement officer who is purchasing the gun to undergo a background check. This is a common sense requirement, given that an officer would undergo a standard background check to purchase the weapon from any other sellers. My colleagues submitted amendments that would add this background check requirement back in. It is unfortunate that that strong and reasonable amendment was not made in order. This amendment, the Jacobs Amendment, does the next best thing. It would further define the good standing requirement and help ensure that retired weapons are only transferred to those who can be trusted with them. This amendment will help close the gap between what a NICS check would reveal and what an employing federal law enforcement agency would find in making a determination that an officer is in good standing. I urge the colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back to the gentlelady.
I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Yeah, I would just like to add that by requiring agencies to have procedures to determine whether an officer is in good standing, this amendment would ensure that officers are treated fairly and only denied the purchase of their handgun for good, objective reasons. And by establishing a deadline for federal law enforcement agencies to establish these procedures, this amendment will ensure that an agency is not caught off guard when an officer who may have issues related to performance or behavior requests to purchase a weapon. I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Reserve, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Do you want to close?
The gentleman from South Carolina has the right to close.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'll just reiterate what I previously discussed, and I would urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman reserve. Gentleman from
Yield.
California is recognized. Gentlelady yields.